Yeah, I think so. We'll just, again, we're recording, so if folks miss a little bit in the beginning, they will be able to go back if they wish.
Mm-hmm.
And really appreciate you being here, Alex. I'll just, for the group, the whole way I discovered Alex and this topic was through the California Preservation Foundation conference, which was also on Zoom recently. And so I was just delighted that Alex was willing to, it looked like he did a lot of outreach and knows this topic really well. So I was really happy when he was willing to be one of our presenters. So thank you so much, Alex. And you can say more about your background.
Sure, yeah.
As it relates to this.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the Placerville History Channel then? It sounds like this is a series of presentations you've had.
Sure, we just, we have so many historic resources and a lot of folks that are working on different aspects of historic preservation and history-based education and special events. And we've got, a historic Main Street and a lot of neat things going on. And so this was trying to kind of create a community forum to bring folks together. But it's pretty new. This is just the fourth week that we've been doing this. And of course, COVID made us all, much more sort of, receptive and experienced with using formats like this. And it's great because obviously, it's a lot easier than trying to rent a venue or find a venue big enough, to just invite, the public at large. So I would just say, there's a number of different history-based groups. We've got a historical society, we've got a heritage association, we've got another group called Friends of Historic Hangtown, we have a planning commission, we have a El Dorado County Museum that has a lot of volunteers, and the state park, of course, the Marshall Gold Discovery has a huge volunteer docent program. American River Conservancy also has a huge volunteer group, and they have the Wakamatsu site, which you might be familiar with now. It's the first Japanese colony, and so they had a big 150th anniversary, so they got a lot of publicity around that and more participation. So there's just been a lot of different groups and networks crossing paths and things. So
great.
So, yeah,
I saw that presentation at CPF. So it's really great to sort of uncover these intersectionalities between different people and the work that they do. And that's the great thing about conferences like California Preservation Foundation that bring people together and can sort of follow up with exchange of projects and sort of continue to explore how we can work together on things to kind of strengthen and bolster the state's historical resources. So yeah, I'll get started then, and I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. And of course, this can be informal. People, if you have questions, then feel free to ask. And of course, I encourage folks to use the chat box as well. If you have comments and things, don't hesitate to use that. And so myself, my name is Alex Westhoff. I'm a senior preservation planner for the San Francisco Planning Department. I've worked there a bit over a year now. I'm in the Southeast Quadrant and work on a variety of different sorts of projects, largely related to obviously historical resources, and work closely with our Historic Preservation Commission. Previously, I also worked for Marin County for 5 years on sea level rise adaptation and coastal hazards, as well as preservation. Prior to that, I was with the Delta Protection Commission for 7 years, and that's largely what I'm going to be talking about today. And then previous to that, I worked, or I was a student at UC Berkeley. I got my master's in landscape architecture and city planning, a dual degree, and I wrote my master's thesis, which initially proposed the concept of the Delta National Heritage Area, and then went on to work. I was interning for the commission, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history of how this all got started, but continued to pursue that through the feasibility study and some other heritage area projects. The Delta Protection Commission is a state agency. They have land use authority over the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area. So any projects proposed in what's called the primary zone of the Delta, they have purview over that. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the other work they do as well. But here we are. So This is actually my cover slide, a historically significant bridge. So this is called the Paintersville Bridge. It's right just south of the small town of Cortland, which is one of the Delta's historic communities. So this and a handful of other bridges were designed by Joseph Strauss, who was the engineer for the Golden Gate Bridge. So that's one significant resource throughout the Delta, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Yolo counties, Solano, Contra Costa, those are the 5 Delta counties. And there's just some wonderful bridges there that date back to the early 1900s. So it's worth taking a look at those. And so this is the Delta. And if we are in a room together, I may ask for a show of hands in terms of who's actually been to the Delta before. A recent survey concluded that 80% of Californians don't even know what the Delta is. So like what I would like to ask, if you don't mind in the Zoom chat, if for those that have been to the Delta, if you can just state one thing you like best about the Delta, whether it's like somewhere you visited in the Delta, just a feeling or association you have with the Delta, a specific activity, just as kind of an icebreaker, so I know like who's familiar with the Delta and sort of what you think of when you think of the Delta. It would be appreciated if you could just type that into the chat box. But a lot of Californians don't know about the Delta. And so I'll just give a really quick overview for those that have not been there. Largely, I'm going to be talking about cultural heritage today, but of course, the Delta's natural resources are very much embedded within the Delta's cultural identity. And so in terms of its natural resources, it's quite significant. It's the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. It's the 2nd largest estuary in the United States next to the Chesapeake Bay. And it's often referred to as an inverse delta as it branches outwards as it goes inland. Most deltaic systems like the Nile Delta, if you think about that, it branches outwards as it drains into the Mediterranean Sea. And that's more typical of deltaic landscapes. But our delta, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, drains inland as it goes inland. It drains and branches out essentially. So that's very unique. The Delta is the confluence of California's 2 largest river systems, with the Sacramento River flowing from the north and the San Joaquin flowing from the south. And together they drain about 40% of California, so their watershed is enormous. And this includes most of the Central Valley as well as the Sierra Nevadas. And the 2 rivers meet and form this intricate network of sloughs and waterways, and they surround what are called the Delta Islands. So there's dozens of these islands, which are landforms largely used for agriculture now, although some of them still have natural resources, but largely they're agriculture, and they're surrounded by levees, and there's about 1,100 miles of Delta levees. So for those that haven't been, if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area and you're driving east, when you get to around Pittsburgh, Antioch, you'd start to get glimpses of the Delta and see its waterways. And then if you were in Antioch, you could take Highway 160, which is a scenic state route, and it goes along the Sacramento River along its entirety until it reaches Sacramento, which is about 60 miles away. But you would pass through many of what are called the legacy communities. So those are communities such as Isleton, Walnut Grove, Cortland. They're small towns, and they're really the cultural and historical hubs of the Delta. They date back to the 1800s, most of them. They began largely as steamboat landings, and a lot of them really haven't changed much since. Because the Delta is the primary zone, actually protects the Delta from urbanization, they've really been able to maintain a small town character. Alternately, from Antioch, you could also drive along State Route 4 and eventually get to Stockton and other Central Valley cities. And of course, that really gives you glimpses of Delta agribusiness and the important role that it plays as a world food supplier. But of course, despite it being a very idyllic landscape, it's not without threats. So the Delta lies between these 3 major urban areas of the San Francisco Bay Area, the Sacramento region, and Stockton and other Central Valley communities. And of course, there is rapid development around the Delta's periphery, and sort of the dream of home ownership, and you know, the Central Valley has taken off, and some people have very long commutes into San Francisco and are living out there because property is more affordable out there. And so there's a lot of concern about urbanization. Thankfully, as I mentioned, the primary zone of the Delta protects sort of the heart of the Delta from urbanization, but around the secondary zone, urbanization is depleting much of the Delta's natural and agricultural resources. Other concerns are subsidence. I mentioned the Delta Islands, and some of them have subsided up to 30 feet, and they're because of oxidation of the peat soils. They've sunk since reclamation, and they're surrounded by what people think of as aging levees. And there's some debate about how vulnerable the Delta is, but there's certainly concern from some that there could be catastrophic levee failure, which would lead to horrible flooding of the Delta. And of course, circa 2005, Hurricane Katrina happened. There was heightened awareness, you know, throughout the country and throughout the world, really, about the dangers of development behind older levees, and that we could have a repeat of an event such as that. So that really led to more broader discussions, sort of regional planning efforts about the Delta and envisioning different futures to ensure something like that does not happen. And of course, another major threat to the Delta is water exports. The Delta is an important water supplier for the state of California. Something like 2/3 of Californians are dependent on Delta water. And this includes 4 million acres of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley and 25 million California residents, largely in Southern California. And over the years, there's been various efforts to increase the amount of water that's exported from the Delta. And this goes back to the 1980s and then Governor Brown's peripheral canal proposal. And that did not pass, but there have been other similar efforts since when he got back into the office, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan that also was pushing for increased water exports. And this is really a concern amongst Delta residents because they feel that the amount of water that would then be exported would not sustain the Delta any longer, and it would lose all of its cultural and economic vitality. So many Delta residents look at that as the death of the Delta. So around 2007, all these concerns sort of started rising to the surface, and various state agencies started talking to one another. And then Governor Schwarzenegger launched what was called the Delta Vision process. And that was a multi-year, multi-stakeholder process that started envisioning different futures for the Delta and developing a plan that could lead to a more sustainable Delta. And that led to the Delta Reform Act of 2009. The Delta Reform Act of 2009 included these co-equal goals, which was water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. What was missing from these goals, however, was any discussion about the unique cultural heritage of the Delta and the fact that the Delta is a lived-in landscape and has this very human element to it that was not being discussed. So there was concern about that. Thankfully, the co-equal goals included a statement that they shall be achieved in a manner that protects and enhances the unique cultural, recreational, natural resource, and agricultural values of the Delta as an evolving place. So it was really this concept of Delta as place that was supposed to bolster this human element of the Delta. So I mentioned I was interning for the Delta Protection Commission, a grad student at UC Berkeley. Through my master's thesis, I started exploring various tools to advance this concept of Delta as place and found out about national heritage areas and started doing historical research on the Delta and found out how it could well fit sort of the requirements for a national heritage area and seemed like a very good candidate for one. So I started making presentations about the concept to various stakeholder groups throughout the Delta. And from there, we were able to include it in the Delta Reform Act, and that led to enabling legislation that was introduced by Senator Feinstein and Congressman Garamendi to actually establish the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area. So this legislation was introduced 5 times until it finally passed in 2019. We were kind of concerned it would never happen, but eventually it did. And so it's now California's first national heritage area. So over the next several slides, I'll jump into the Delta's historical significance. But before I do that, I just want to read this Chinese proverb: when you drink water, consider the fountain. So I think this rings true when speaking about the Delta, because you know, the water, its importance as a water supplier cannot be understated, but that's really just part of the Delta story. And there is this rich human element to the Delta as well. So through the next several slides, I'm going to showcase the Delta's history, largely for, and this came from my master's thesis and then led into the feasibility study that we did for the heritage area. A lot of the work I was doing was researching the Delta's history. And while I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, I had Bancroft Library at my fingertips and some other wonderful resources that Berkeley provided. But we largely looked at an 80-year period of significance, starting in 1849 during the gold rush and extending through the era of reclamation, which ended in 1934. So during this time, the waters of the deltas were heavily explored by 49ers who were traveling from the San Francisco Bay to the Sierra Nevadas to search for gold. It's estimated that during this time, nearly 44,000 people passed through the delta, at which point they really discovered the high fertility of the delta's peat soils. And because of the readily available irrigation water, it was deemed prime for agriculture. So efforts were initiated to convert the delta's islands from marshlands to farmlands through the development of levees to protect the islands from flooding. And much of the native vegetation was then removed. In 1850, the Swamp and Overflow Land Act conveyed ownership of all swamp and overflow lands from the federal government to the state of California, and shortly thereafter, most of California's marshes were privately owned. So important equipment was invented during this time in the Delta. This image on the left is the side draft clamshell dredge, which was developed specifically for building levees in the Delta. These dredges were powered by steam and collected soils from the alluvial channels that were piled around the edges of the Delta Islands, and that helped create sturdier levees. So this innovation not only transformed the Delta itself, but also led California entrepreneurs to introduce the world to a new system of dredging. Equipment developed for Delta reclamation has been used throughout the world for a variety of purposes, including the construction of the Panama Canal, the deepening of the San Francisco Bay, dredging coral for outpost construction during World War II in several Pacific islands, and reclaiming the Tulare Lake Basin. So after the gold rush, steamboats remained a common way to travel the Delta, both for recreation as well as the transport of goods. So this image on the right is of the Netherlands route. Because of the levees throughout the Delta was branded as the Netherlands route, and there was a lot of Dutch expertise in the Delta to help develop the levee system. But of course, other famous steamboats traveled the waters as well. The Delta Queen and the Delta King. The Delta King is now docked in Old Sacramento, but those two beautiful paddle wheels took the Delta route on a daily basis beginning in 1927 and passed one another. They went from San Francisco to Sacramento and passed each other in Rio Vista. And of course, no discussion on the Delta's history would be complete without focusing on the various immigrant groups that really shaped the Delta and were pivotal in its role in reclamation as well as subsequent agriculture, are particularly the Asian Pacific Islander immigrant groups. Around 12,000 Chinese immigrants had come to the area to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. And when that project was complete, many found work in Delta reclamation and agriculture. Due to the large number of Chinese immigrants living in the Delta, several Chinatowns popped up along the Sacramento River, as the map on the right shows. This includes towns in Isleton, Walnut Grove. Of course, the town of Locke is the only town in the United States that was developed exclusively by and for Chinese immigrants and is now a National Historic Landmark. That's actually the backdrop of my Zoom call, in case you're wondering what that photo is. That's of the town of Locke. Japanese immigration also began in California in the late 1800s. Japanese immigrants began to replace Chinese farm laborers who had been banned from further immigration by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. A handful of historic Japanese American sites remain in the Delta as well. The map shown on the left-hand side was actually used to pass 1924 federal legislation, which barred further Japanese immigration. There was concern that Asian immigrants were taking over some of the best land in California. And this, essentially, this is the Delta here, this very, kind of colorful area. Those are all parcels of land that were owned or leased by Asian immigrants. And it shows the extensive amount of Asian American land holdings in the Delta. Of course, Filipinos played a very important role to provide labor for the Delta to ensure it remained a world food supplier. There's historic Filipino sites as well, such as the Little Manila neighborhood in Stockton. Currently, the population of Asian Americans in the Delta is quite low, but their legacy remains quite prevalent. This is actually a map of a potential Asian Pacific Islander heritage corridor. And as you can see from Rio Vista to Clarksburg, there is a wide variety of Asian American historic sites throughout the Delta. And we want to emphasize it's not just about the historic architecture. Of course, that's quite important. But there are other sorts of things like museum displays, monuments. There's things like the restored Miyazaki bathhouse. There's a small Chinese cemetery in Rio Vista. There's also annual festivals in towns such as Locke and Isleton, which celebrate Asian Pacific Islander heritage. So the sort of legacy of Asian Americans in the Delta is still quite prevalent. And we've been talking about agriculture, but of course the agricultural heritage of the Delta is very important, dating back to reclamation and continuing today. So it's been an extremely productive agricultural region. Around World War I, the Bartlett pear market was at its peak, and almost 50% of all Bartletts were produced in the region. Until 1930, the Delta was known as the asparagus capital of the world, and it produced 90% of the world's asparagus. Of course, there's annual festivals for people to celebrate both of those crops. There's the Cortland Pear Fair that happens in summer. This is under normal circumstances, of course, but there's the Stockton Asparagus Festival that happens in late spring. So those are wonderful ways to celebrate the agricultural heritage of the Delta. And visitors can engage in activities such as U-picks, farm stands, wineries. Clarksburg is really a burgeoning wine region, and that really celebrate these various crops. Besides pears and asparagus, other crops have included sugar beets, Irish potatoes, peaches, plums, cherries, tomatoes, beans, onions, peas, celery, corn, and a whole lot of others. The Delta's waterways served as early means to transport goods to Sacramento for the mining communities and to San Francisco for shipment overseas. Later, railroads and trucks were utilized for national transport. Large corporations included Del Monte, National Cannery, Sun Garden, Heinz, Libby McNeil, Pat Lowe, and Golden State, all who established canneries in the Delta and employed many of its residents. And of course, besides the crops themselves, the Delta was a very important place for agricultural equipment innovation. And this image that's shown on the lower right is perhaps the most notable piece of equipment that was developed for Delta agriculture. And that's the original Caterpillar tractor, which was developed by Benjamin Holt out of Stockton in 1906. So previous tractors were getting stuck in the peaty Delta soils. They had large wheels instead of tracks, so it was easy for them to get stuck. And this invention prevented tractors from getting stuck. So that revolutionized not just agriculture in the Delta, but throughout the United States and world as well. And so part of the National Heritage Area designation, of course, is making the case for national significance. And so some of these various things that have shown, like the side draft clamshell dredge, the Caterpillar tractor, the town of Locke being the only town in the United States developed exclusively by and for Chinese immigrants. These are all different facets that make the Delta a nationally significant region. And so that was an important distinction that we made when we were sort of presenting the story of the Delta's history. So of course the Caterpillar tractor, this design was used throughout the world for purposes besides farming, including the development of machines that helped end World War I, tumble the Berlin Wall, build the Hoover Dam, and tunnel under the English Channel, and of course construction for cities throughout the United States. So that was a really quick overview of the Delta's historical significance. And I'll talk a little about a little bit about what national heritage areas are. And so this is the definition from the National Park Service. A national heritage area is a place designated by Congress where natural, cultural, historic, and scenic resources combine to form a cohesive, nationally distinctive landscape arising from patterns of human activity shaped by geography. These patterns make national heritage areas representative of the national experience through the physical features that remain and the traditions that have evolved in them. Continued use of national heritage areas by people whose traditions help to shape the landscapes enhance their significance. So essentially, some of the benefits of National Heritage Area designation are the use of the National Park Service arrowhead symbol, which can be used for branding. It's placed on the National Park Service's website, so that helps gain visibility for the region and increase heritage tourism, which can help with economic development. And there is funding that comes from the National Park Service that can be utilized for a variety of different sorts of projects, which I'll talk about. In the case of the Delta, there was also interest in sort of building more clout for the Delta. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there's been a lot of efforts to divert water from the Delta, and the state hasn't always really been considering the people of the Delta and sort of the continued vitality of the Delta. And so there's some concern about that. And perhaps with having a national designation that could help gain some clout and have sort of this seal of approval that this is an important landscape that does need to be considered in these broader planning and policy efforts. So this is a map of national heritage areas. So currently there's 55. Previously, for some time, there was only 49 prior to the legislation, if I have my numbers right, that passed just last year. And most of them, as you can see, are largely on the East Coast, and they've kind of expanded into the Midwest. But there aren't a whole lot on the West Coast. This is the only one in California, the Delta, and there's a couple more that were recently established in Washington as well. But it largely has been focused on the East Coast. And there's a variety of different types of heritage areas and sort of, you know, what stories they tell. Some are centered around, there are several that are centered around river corridors like the Delta, coal mining, other sorts of industries which were important in the East Coast. There are like the silos and smokestacks, National Heritage Area in Iowa that is also important for the agricultural heritage of the Midwest. There's the Gulan-Gili Heritage Corridor that extends through several states in Florida that tells important stories about a particular group of people. There's the Tennessee Heritage Area that is mainly about the Civil War. So they all tell a variety of different stories, and I encourage folks to check out National Park Service's website and find out more information about these specific heritage areas. After the Delta Reform Act, that required us to actually do a feasibility study for the National Heritage Area. And we embarked upon this multi-year process. And really central to that was stakeholder outreach, of course. So I mentioned some people were very excited about the concept and really saw it as a good way to advance placemaking and preservation projects throughout the Delta, as well as gain more visibility for the region, which could help with economic development and just generally, as I was mentioning, more clout for the region. There were some people that were concerned, though, as well, and some people heard that it was some National Park Service program, and that must mean there's some strings attached, and the federal government is now getting involved. And the next thing you know, the entire Delta is going to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and people won't be allowed to paint their homes certain colors. And of course, we tried to be very sensitive to these concerns and really listen to what they were and address them through our outreach process. But we really put outreach front and center, and we did all sorts of different types of outreach, including traditional public meetings. The images on this slide show participatory mapping activities where stakeholders were invited to identify heritage assets on large maps that they wanted included in the heritage area and develop what themes they thought should be included in the heritage area. We did stakeholder interviews as well, and we did, social media outreach. And what we really found to be the most effective, though, was just going to where the people are. And so rather than invite people to our meetings, because there's something called stakeholder fatigue, and many of the very engaged citizens in the Delta could be going to different public meetings every night of the week about a different topic. And this is in addition to their professional and personal commitments, of course. So we tried to be as extensive as possible and just went to dozens of different stakeholder groups, from the historical societies to the various recreational groups and the conservation groups, the reclamation districts. Of course, we made presentations to all the boards of supervisors and city councils throughout the Delta. So it really got to be a full-time job at one point. But it was definitely worth it because it really helped build credibility for our process. Even some folks in the end, there was still concern from some very vocal people about this concept, but they at least did give us credit for the amount of outreach and engagement they did, and did state that they felt the process was very transparent. When I first started working for the commission, we were just a very small agency. There was only a staff of 2. And we were based in this very small historic home in Walnut Grove, right in the heart of the Delta. And farmers would stop in and drop off pears or bags of corn or whatever the crop was. And it really helped us foster more kind of, one-on-one discussions, casual discussions about this concept, as well as other initiatives of the commission. But it helped us establish what felt like a very grassroots process. And that was really important. Of course, we were very objective about it throughout it. It was just a feasibility study. There was no predetermined outcome. We, of course, we're available. I'm available, and current commission staff as well, to share more details about our outreach and engagement process if you have any questions. And this is the map of the heritage area. If you can see my cursor, this is essentially the Delta. So as you see, the heritage area goes beyond the Delta itself, but also included the Carquinez Strait. When we first got started on this, we got contacted by the Carquinez Strait Preservation Group, stating they were interested in heritage area designation as well, and had actually done something to document all of their heritage resources and make a case for a heritage area as well. And we started speaking with them, and there was shared themes amongst the 2 regions, and it was certainly easy to sort of incorporate them into our heritage area. So these actual boundaries came from the 5 Delta counties who stated these are the areas that we want included in the heritage area. As I mentioned, much of the Delta, the Yobo bypass up here, and the Carquinez Strait as well. The next step that's currently underway, now that it's been designated, is a management plan. And I can talk more about that, but the management plan included 5 themes. And I'm not going to go over these in great detail because they largely stemmed from the historical significance that I discussed. But one of the themes was largely about the Delta's geography and its important sort of natural heritage, as well as just sort of its location in the very heart of California, and how it's been an important corridor for a variety of people as well as animals like on the Pacific Flyway. The next theme is about reclamation and the fact that the Delta is one of the largest reclamation projects in the United States over this 80-year period. The next theme is about multicultural contributions, largely focusing on the important role of Asian Pacific Islanders in shaping the Delta. The Delta is often referred to as California's cornucopia, and that makes up theme number 4. And finally, water resources that I've discussed and all the political challenges surrounding them are the 5th theme. So some advice we got from National Park Service. Once we finished the feasibility study, we asked, well, what do we do as next steps? And their advice was, well, if you want to become a heritage area, start acting like a heritage area. So we started undertaking some pilot projects that were heritage area type projects. And we started establishing partnerships with a variety of different groups, including a number of historical groups throughout the Delta, nonprofit groups, conservation groups, agricultural tourism groups, and interested partners that wanted to undertake projects to help build the heritage area, essentially. And now that the management plan process is underway, the current commission staff is working on the plan that identifies what sort of projects will continue to evolve through the heritage area process, and eventually projects such as these can receive the federal funding that comes along with heritage area designation. And I see that I'm at my 30-minute mark, so I'll try and wrap up. But the Delta Anthology is an important part, trying to sort of collect all the written material about the Delta, of which there is a fair amount, but some of these documents are out of print, and it's important that we bring these things together. A Delta Awareness Campaign, definitely check out the URL, visitcalifornia.com, where you can find different sites and activities and events and things that are happening in the Delta. Community action planning and community design study to kind of bolster sort of the viability of the Delta's legacy communities and assist with things like preservation and placemaking that are sort of more welcoming to visitors, but at the same time are something that can be backed by the local residents of the Delta. There's an annual Delta Heritage Forum, which I encourage people to check out. It's usually in June. I know it's been canceled or perhaps postponed for this year, but definitely something to check out for once it's rescheduled. Delta Narratives that stem from the University of Pacific. There was a whole curriculum developed that stemmed upon the 5 themes that I mentioned of the Delta. A Great California Delta Trail Master Plan. This was actually something we were mandated to do, was develop a regional trail network that connects Sacramento River trails with the San Francisco Bay trails to have one of the largest regional trail systems in the state. Heritage projects feasibility studies, a number of historic buildings in the Delta. There's been feasibility studies underway to identify what would be necessary for successful adaptive reuse of these properties. The Holland Union Gakuen Workshop. A Gakuen is a Japanese language school, of which there's a few remaining pre-World War II Japanese language schools in the Delta. There's not many left throughout the state, and one sat vacant for many, many years, and we undertook a charrette, a reuse charrette, with a group that used to actually use the language school of Japanese Americans, as well as professionals such as architects and preservationists who could bring their technical expertise to talk about different scenarios for the future of this modest site. And then sort of this interpretive plan to help further brand the Delta, particularly for visitors that are in the Delta, because many people really, could very easily get lost in the Delta. So having more signage throughout the Delta is of importance. And it really stems to the question of what is the Delta's there? And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, something like 80% of Californians don't even know what the Delta is. But hopefully, as I've illustrated throughout this presentation, it has not just a rich history, but some really unique assets that merit actually visiting the Delta. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Hopefully for those that haven't been out to the Delta before, this has piqued your interest in seeing it. But for more information, be sure and check out the Delta Protections Commission's website. I'll put it in the chat box. It's delta.ca.gov. But you can find out more information about the current state of the heritage area, and I can take questions from here.
Wow, thank you so much. That was amazing, and I'm sure there will be questions. So folks, we'll just sort of try to self-manage, and if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. Does anybody want to start?
Alex, can we use this to stop the Delta Tunnel?
Well, that's a good question. I'm now 6 years removed from the Delta, so this has been an ongoing issue, of course. When I worked for the Delta Protection Commission, that was when the Bay Delta Conservation Plan was being proposed. So the Delta Protection Commission does have land use authority, as I mentioned, over the Delta. So we did have some purview in terms of like how would the tunnels affect land use. And of course, a pretty compelling case can be made that in fact the tunnels will impact land use. And so we wrote a pretty extensive comment letter about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and identified how it would impact these things and the historic communities and all the important assets throughout the Delta. And we didn't feel like their mitigation efforts were good enough to make up for the loss of some of these, these communities really. So I'm not sure how, they really took our comment letter, but at least it went on record. So there's that. I think the nice thing that was very endearing to hear, once the legislation was passed, I was invited back to sort of an opening ceremony for the heritage area where Congress Garamendi was speaking at it. And just hearing what people said that were Delta residents. I was at a really nice historic home in Cortland, right along the Sacramento River, but just that, now we have something to grasp onto. Now we're a nationally significant landscape, so it does help us build some clout in these discussions with the state about these efforts such as the tunnels. So it's not like, really it's a little more fuzzier of a tool, but there certainly is some discussion that it could help.
David, I know David is very interested in conservation easements, and I just wondered if you could say anything about if that tool has a role.
Yeah, well, there's certainly agricultural conservation easements in the periphery of the Delta. I mentioned that there's rapid urbanization happening around sort of the outskirts of the Delta from the Bay Area and Stockton, et cetera. So there are some. There's the Brentwood Agricultural Land Trust that's been very active as well to kind of retain the agritourism that exists there. I will say one thing that there isn't a lot of though is the preservation easements, and there's not really an entity that played that role when we did. I mentioned the charrette for the historic Japanese American Language School, and we kind of couldn't find a local entity that could potentially hold the conservation easement to help protect this site. So we felt like that was a loss, and that's something that perhaps the Delta could benefit from. There's also the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy that stemmed from the Delta Reform Act as well. They're now about 6, 7 years old. So they do oversee easements within the Delta. I know they did get a fair amount of funding, but I think largely they're looking at habitat easements as well. So there are a variety of different agencies out there that sort of have different roles, but in terms of like historic heritage type easements, that was lacking in the Delta.
I had a question. I was wondering if first of all, I wasn't quite clear because I was cooking dinner in the middle of this, so I'm sorry. I was not quite clear how much, is there funding that comes with the heritage designation, or is it more of a multi-agency collaboration as you're describing? And then secondly, just a matter of curiosity, Robert Kelly was really, really important to the founding of the public history program at UC Santa Barbara and also nationally, the National Council on Public History. And most of his academic work, as I recall, was about water rights and water conservation litigation in the Sacramento River system. And I don't know if his work was at all important to understanding the kind of deep history in the 19th century of this, or is it just forgotten now?
Yeah, so as far as funding, there is funding that comes from National Park Service for various projects, and it really just depends on what's in the management plan. So this can include things like historic preservation or restoration of historic sites, or, you know, it can go to staffing the heritage area, or, you know, branding, and you know, a handful of different types of projects. And it's not as much as it once was now that there are more and more heritage areas. I believe within the first 3 years when an entity is developing the management plan, and I know we're recorded, but, you know, don't quote me on this, but it's, I believe it's 150,000 now for the first 3 years. And then after that, it's roughly around $300,000. And I know that amount varies depending on sort of the need, and National Park Service ultimately makes the final call. But that's what we were told when we were working on the feasibility study. And then as far as Robert Kelly, you know, I'm not familiar with him. You know, I'm sure that we would be interested in looking at his work, and I can certainly forward information about him to current Delta Protection Commission staff and see if they're aware of what he's done.
Sure thing. I'll private message you in the chat about him.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. I see it just went away. Is there a way you could get the map back up on here again? Sure. Yeah, the map that shows the boundaries.
Yep.
There we go. I'm just curious as to what the commissions, would there be review authority, for example, for the communities, for example, Benicia, Vallejo, Antioch, Pittsburgh, that, you know, border this? If there are projects along the shoreline, is there any additional review that's required from this commission in addition to the city's review that they would perform for their projects?
Sure, and that's a good point. And actually, I apologize, I forgot to mention a really important point. So the heritage area is a non-regulatory tool, and I probably should have mentioned that at the beginning, because you know, the work like I do now, for example, with San Francisco planning is largely regulatory, but this is non-regulatory, which of course put a lot of people at ease as we were proposing this. The Delta Protection Commission would not review projects in the communities that you mentioned. The Delta Protection Commission, of course, already has land use authority for what's called the primary zone of the Delta, which is largely this area, so that wouldn't change with heritage area designation. So those would consider under their current auspices.
Okay, thank you for that explanation.
Alex, I have a question. Are you aware of any other areas of California that are pursuing the same designation currently? And do you have any do's and don'ts if, you know, another area such as El Dorado County were to pursue it? How would you get started? And is it important to have multiple agency support? Can you do it with a single historic society? I mean, just the do's and don'ts of how to be successful with this.
Yeah, well, there definitely are other regions that are pursuing it or have pursued it. I know Monterey and 2 surrounding counties have been talking about it for quite some time, and they formed an alliance to advance that concept. Mendocino County, I know, is interested. I don't know, I haven't heard much about that effort for some time, but those are 2 that are popping to mind. So, you know, it's, in terms of advice, it's difficult because it really depends on the area, of course. We were fortunate because we're an existing state agency, the Delta Protection Commission, that obviously we already had funding, we had staffing, we already had a network of constituents that were aware of us and, you know, generally trusted us. So we already had sort of that outreach element embedded within the work we did on a day-to-day basis. But we were already fairly far along. Certainly, there are other heritage areas that are managed by state agencies, and even a few that are managed by federal agencies. Largely, they're managed by nonprofits, though, the majority of them. And so there definitely have been entities that have formed specifically to develop a heritage area. As first steps, one thing, of course, would just to become familiar with the requirements for a heritage area. National Park Service's website certainly outlines them pretty clearly. They have interim guidance that's been, I know that they're trying to formalize the program a little better, but right now they actually don't have a formal program. It's based on this interim guidance that's available on their website. National Park Service don't actually designate the heritage areas. They're designated by Congress, but National Park Service can testify in Congress if an area actually meets the heritage area criteria. So it's important to work with them early on. There is a staff member out of the San Francisco National Park Service office. She was one of the co-presenters on last week's California Preservation Foundation session that I was on, named Linda Stonier. She oversees existing and emerging heritage areas throughout the West Coast, so she would be a good first point of contact to just express interest. I mentioned the website, of course. The sort of, off the top of my head, the things you would need. You'd need to be able to make a case for national significance, something parallel to what I presented in this presentation. You would need to identify what the local coordinating agency is that I sort of overviewed just now. You'd obviously have to find someone to sponsor it in Congress too, so it wouldn't hurt to reach out to sort of local congressional leaders and kind of gauge interest from there. Of course, I mentioned public outreach, and that's a really important role because you do need to make the case that there is support from the local communities on this. We really did, I mentioned, quite a bit of outreach. In the end, we gained many letters of support from various groups that I outlined, so that was really helpful. Also letters of partnership commitment that stated if it becomes a heritage area, these are the sorts of things that we could do to help kind of augment the commission's efforts, so that really helped make a compelling case. Additionally, like a resource inventory is part of it, so it needs to have a nationally significant story, but also it needs to be shown that there are still resources that support this story. So whether they're historic buildings or other sites of historical interest. I know National Park Service is very much interested in showing that these aren't just historical areas, but areas that kind of celebrate heritage today. Like these are living heritage areas, so things like annual festivals are important. Intangible things like traditions, food, art, dance, music, things like that can also be documented, like if they're specific to this region and also kind of align with what the themes and the statement of significance is. So that's sort of a long answer. There's no real one-size-fits-all approach, but hopefully it's giving you some information to get started. And of course, feel free to reach out to me for more information if you'd like.
So let me extend it a little bit further. If you were looking to establish a gold history heritage area, would you look at starting within a given county or try to look across multiple counties for the gold rush historical symbolism of the whole series of counties? And because this was obviously a coalition of multiple counties, and I'm just trying to get a feel for how much that weighs in terms of the strength to get the recognition out of the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, that's a good question. I don't know that the size necessarily matters. It's more about like the assemblage of resources. So, if there is more interest amongst different counties, it does seem like that would indicate more support for the heritage area. But it depends on who's introducing it in Congress, of course. I think you do have to have a study area for the feasibility study. So it would be good to say these are the counties that we're looking at as a potential heritage area. And from there, you can kind of like whittle it down into in terms of this is the specific area. So it's supposed to be essentially a map of where the heritage resources are that support that significance and those themes of the heritage area.
Thank you.
So Alex, it seems like your certainly your master's project was really important, and then the heritage, I mean, the feasibility study, and I think both of those came before the actual establishment. And so, it seems like maybe those would be important things, to have a graduate project, and then I think there was some, different sources of funding and interest and motivation to do the feasibility study, correct? Before the actual legislation?
Yeah, all those things are important. I mean, certainly if there is a student that can, take the lead and do things like research the history of the area and make a case for national significance, that, that can be a fairly intensive project. And with student time, if there's history schools or whatnot, something along those lines, I think that would be a great thesis topic, of course. And we had efforts. I mentioned that, we were an existing agency and already had an extensive network of constituents that we were working with. So we could kind of hit the ground running with a lot of this. And this kind of came at a very ideal time, as I mentioned early in the presentation, with the Delta Reform Act, because we were looking at different futures for the Delta. And we were able to include it in that 2006 Delta Reform Act that actually required us to do the feasibility study. So it wasn't just something we were doing because we thought it was a good idea, but we were actually mandated to do. So, but that is a good point. I think willing partners are really critical to the heritage area. So I think I've mentioned a handful of partners that we've had, but local historical societies, local recreational groups, groups that are already working on tourism development, like local chambers of commerce are important groups as well. Certainly if there's state or national parks within the region, they can benefit from it because, presumably they appreciate the influx of tourists that a heritage area could bring. So it would be worth reaching out to them. If there's managers of other historical sites, then they would be ideal partners as well. The different cities and counties are worth reaching out to, of course, because it's important to get support from them, and potentially they could serve as partners. We have the reclamation districts as well in the Delta, so we work closely with them. So those are just some of the groups that are popping to mind. But our feasibility study too, I think that was linked in the announcement for this event, or I can certainly post a link as well, but that also listed all the groups that we did outreach to and all the letters of support and commitment that we received. And so that can give a further glimpse of what types of organizations are the ideal partner organizations.
Alex?
And so I guess you had, go ahead, question.
Alex, I had just a question. Unless I missed it, I didn't hear you address the wildlife in your studies.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly all for that. So I think one of the points that we wanted to make with the heritage area, because there's also a lot of interest in ecosystem restoration throughout the Delta. And of course, these are all sorts of wonderful projects to restore Delta wetlands and make them back to, what the region once was. But then there's concern from the agricultural community, of course, about losing farmlands in the Delta, and that, they're not necessarily thrilled about some of this restoration. And so we wanted to make the point that the Delta is not, just a bird sanctuary, but there's this rich cultural heritage as well. I mean, we certainly mentioned bird life in the Delta, and, the fact that it's along the Pacific Flyway, of course, contributed to the first theme of the heritage area. It also has anadromous fish that it's unique that actually breed inland and then go out to sea as adults. And so like we mentioned those things, but I wouldn't say it was like front and center to making the case for historical significance.
Thank you.
Can you, how far can you take a boat? Can you take a boat all the way kind of almost to the boundaries of the heritage area?
Yeah, well, I mean, boating is very big in the Delta, and there's certainly people that boat from San Francisco into the waterways of the Delta. So I don't, I'm not a boater myself. I don't know where it would end exactly, but you could certainly go pretty far.
Those steamships, you know, are so beautiful, and I can't remember if there are actually, are there still people that do kind of like a, you know, a history tour with the steamboats?
Not that I know of, no. Of course, the Delta King docked in Old Sacramento is probably the best thing you have if you want to, you know, they have a restaurant and a hotel now, so that's worth visiting. That used to travel the waters of the Delta. The Delta Queen has relocated to the Mississippi Delta, but I believe that's actually traveling the waters of the Mississippi, but I don't think there's any functioning steamboats in the Delta or in the San Francisco Bay that for any longer for that matter.
So are there ever any demonstrations of the some of that important equipment that you were showing, like the clam digging? I mean, obviously there's still dredging,
Yeah.
certainly underneath the Golden Gate Bridge channel. I mean, is that ever, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know where it might be demonstrated.
Yeah, I don't think there's active dredging in the Delta. There were like the deep water ship channels like the Sacramento and Stockton that required dredging as well. I don't know of dredging still happening in the Delta. If it's a topic you're interested in though, there was the Dutra Museum of Dredging. They don't have like actual dredging going on anymore, but like they have model displays of it. They have artifacts that were dug up during dredging, and they certainly are sort of the best purveyors of the history of dredging in the Delta. And they're based in Rio Vista. By appointment only though. They're a small museum, but they're definitely worth visiting.
Who else has questions? Just want to make sure we get to anybody else's questions before we wrap up.
I was gonna type the.
Pierre, are you still on here? I'm wondering if you have any questions.
Yes, I'm still here. I don't really have a comment necessarily, but I want to piggyback a little on what some of the comments made by Supervisor John Heidel. I was impressed with the size of the Delta Heritage Area. It's much larger than I would have thought. I was more thinking of an area much smaller, like maybe an area of just a town of Block or something like that. So with a lot of the gold rush heritage we have here in El Dorado County, in fact, we have the Highway 49 known as the Gold Chain. I can really see us trying to form a large area that would actually encompass much of that you know, the gold mining area along the Highway 49 gold chain. I mean, the amount of resources that exist, all the different mining, both placer and hard rock mining throughout that region, plus all the agriculture that has happened and the extensive system of waterways and canals and ditches that were built. There's really a lot there, and I just want to say to Alex, I was extremely impressed by your presentation and the breadth of your knowledge. I could see that you really spent a lot of time working in the Delta. I've explored the Delta pretty extensively myself. I mean, everybody has their favorites. There was nothing like the Crawdad Festival I used to go to years ago, and in Idleton. I don't know if they're trying to revive that, but it's just a wealth of history there. But I also see a lot of those elements all existing along the gold chain. So I can certainly see a partnership with all of the foothill counties getting together and creating a national heritage area along that Highway 49 gold chain.
That sounds like a great idea. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the heritage area concept is about having a cohesive landscape. And if these different communities were all involved in the gold rush, which obviously is a nationally and internationally important story, I think a case could easily be made for a heritage area in that region. And I think it would sort of complement the Delta Heritage Area nicely as, you know, the Delta sort of the gateways to Gold Country, and then, you know, these other areas, like I'm not super familiar with them, but just hearing about them certainly piques my interest in visiting them.
And I do think it's interesting that you mentioned it took you had introduced the legislation 5 times, and, you know, because there was Golden Chain, it was actually a National Heritage Corridor. I don't know how different that is from a National Heritage Area, but that's actually what was originally proposed. I think it was 2002 by a congressman from Fresno, but they only, as far as I know, they only tried to introduce it once. And I think it's interesting you said, do you think that it actually took, you know, I mean, I don't know if there was the same people, you know, kind of at the table in Congress really 5 times. Was it 5 consecutive years? And do you think hearing the story over and over again made a difference?
Well, I think so. I don't fully understand why it took so long. I know there were no new heritage areas being designated over the course of the first 4 the first 4 congressional sessions, which are 2 years. There were no new heritage areas established during that time at all. So, like, I think it took sort of a critical mass of other heritage areas, and I believe their recent legislation was, I think, at least 4, possibly 6 new heritage areas, including the Delta one. So I think once you have a number of similar sorts of proposals, you can kind of group them. You know, they get grouped into more of an omnibus type of package, and it's easier to pass those through Congress. So, like, I think that worked in our favor to actually finally get it to pass. So I, you know, we were kind of surprised it was being reintroduced. We would get near the end of a congressional session and think, you know, we would kind of hear things like it might pass at the end of the session. Nothing would happen. We'd get reintroduced the next session. Again, nothing would happen. I certainly had my doubts that would ever become a reality, but out of nowhere, they did pass it. So I don't really have a lot of great grasp on how Congress works, but it did happen. And so, of course, finding congressional sponsors is really critical to making it become a reality. And I would do that at the onset of pursuing a designation.
Well, it also sounds like from what you just said that maybe it's important to find out about and support the Mendocino and Monterey efforts, and, you know, kind of have a you know, a series of heritage areas, maybe, you know, from California.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, we definitely have a lot of counties that are certainly identified around this Golden Chain corridor. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of making the case for the benefits of this kind of designation. I think people feel that they can promote that kind of thing without the designation. And so, you know, part of it is, and I think you hit on some of those points in your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I don't doubt that some of these things could be undertaken without a heritage area. I mean, the main benefits are more visibility, like national visibility for the region, and the partnership with National Park Service that can help with branding, and tourism development by being put on their maps and on their website. That certainly helps quite a bit. There is the funding that I mentioned that comes along for certain types of projects, and so they would receive that. You know, of course, like heritage tourism can be developed at a local level too, and so it's just about identifying what the benefits are and deciding if it does seem worth pursuit of that. And, you know, we were certainly undertaking other sorts of projects throughout this process. But, you know, prior to this, there really wasn't a lot of discussion about Delta heritage. It wasn't a term people were really using. So I think just telling the story of the Delta's history and making the case for national significance really did open up a lot of people's eyes for how important this region really is. And that did help bring a lot of different groups together to undertake these sorts of projects. So, like, it's not to say that you couldn't do these sorts of projects without a heritage area designation, but I think the heritage area designation really provided a nice framework to undertake these projects with the willing partners.
Well, it's sort of a Heisenberg principle, you know, kind of when you study something and it forces coordination that might be happening, but might not be happening in the absence of this project that everybody's bought into. And it gives you a chance to vet kind of the different historical strands, cultural strands, preservation strands, environmental strands that you're going to try to encapsulate in this team. So it creates something, and on the other end of creating a heritage site, you've got something different than what you had at the beginning, I think. It's a beautiful story.
Yeah, yeah. And I will say, you know, while I'm kind of talking about lessons learned from our effort and what could potentially be applied to your endeavor, is that there were certainly, I mentioned this in my presentation, but there were certain concerns about heritage area designation, federal involvement. I obviously identified these concerns. They were voiced to us early on, and we did quite a bit of research. We contacted other heritage areas, asked, are there any strings attached? And the response we always got was, no, there isn't. And you know, people outlined the specifics of what it meant. And we conveyed that to the local stakeholders, but there was still just a lot of sort of resistance, or, you know, people were skeptical about that, and they were still convinced that there had to be some sorts of strings attached. And you know, I do think the Delta is unique, and I'm sure your region might have this, but I mean, the Delta has like 4th or 5th generation farming families there. It's like their great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were the same people that lived on the land that they currently live on, and were the people that undertook reclamation and developed the Delta as we know it today. So it's very much not a transient region. So people are not going to take these sorts of proposals very lightly. So like we were very sensitive to those concerns, but I do, you know, I do suspect that the same thing could be true for your region, that there could be, it may be met with skepticism from some. And this is also what we heard from National Park Service, from other regions that were largely agricultural based, that there could be some resistance. So that's why it's really important to engage the community through the process. We had a stakeholder advisory committee that was very instrumental in sort of some of these early discussions, and helped structure the feasibility study. But we met with them regularly, and we had representatives from different agricultural groups that were part of the advisory committee, as well as, you know, reclamation groups and history groups. But we were sure that the agricultural interests were front and center, because you know, if they weren't, they, you know, that could increase their skepticism. And we wanted to make sure it was a sort of very transparent and participatory process throughout its entirety. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily start having big public meetings at the very beginning, because you might get met with a lot of questions that aren't answered yet. It's like you want engagement at the beginning, but at the flip side, people might want to know exactly how it's going to impact their properties. Like, I would sort of start with, you know, smaller meetings or stakeholder advisory committees, but reach out to people from the various groups and invite them to the table and have smaller discussions, possibly as an early step to, and that can help kind of gauge broader interest for a concept like this. Just my 2 cents from this experience.
Great. Yeah, I definitely think private land ownership is a key thing. People look at that boundary and they want to know, what does it mean, you know, to my private property if I'm in there? And that's why it's actually, this is an amazing story that you had people and areas and communities that said, we want a bigger boundary.
Yeah,
That's pretty amazing.
And there is opt-out provisions too. So any landowner within any of this region can say they don't want to be included in the heritage area, and they can actually not be included in the boundary. So, you know, we certainly relayed that, just in case there are people that are still convinced that there's going to be some kind of increased land use controls, that's a good message to relay to them.
Did you have any of that?
No, not that I know of. No one has opted out of it, but we let people know about that. And there's other concerns that some people just don't want an influx of tourism. They don't want more people in the Delta. They moved to the Delta because they wanted to be removed from city life and sort of like the peacefulness and the tranquility of it. And it's tough to know how to address those, because then there's the other side of things, that the people that do live in the Delta and actually want more tourism because they recognize the economic value of it. You know, sort of how we address that. Most of the key kind of sites largely do lie along the Sacramento River. The historic communities that I mentioned are where a lot of the heritage area type sites are anyway. So we didn't see a lot of people driving out here or here, even if we're in the boundaries. So I think that also did help abate some concerns. But the most important thing is to bring people to the table and make sure their voices are heard, and that can help tease out some of the bigger issues and then work on identifying solutions to those issues.
So going back to your corridor, because I know that actually one of the folks commented on really liking that extra, you know, corridor identification that you mentioned. Do you see that having some extra designation to the Pacific Heritage Corridor?
Yeah, I don't think it would have its own designation, and I can pop up that. These resources are all being identified in the management plan for one. The Asian Pacific Islander heritage is one of the 5 themes, so that's really pivotal. This might be something good that could come down the line for more like tourism promotion, like sort of heritage tourism, if people were interested in sort of this specific facet of the Delta's history, then something like this would nicely fit that bill.
Great. Any other questions out there? Alex is gone over here for our invitation, but thank you. It's been so great. I just want to make sure, and if anybody else has any more questions, that we take the opportunity.
Bring up my email once more, but I'm certainly available as a resource. So don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. I don't mind providing additional advice, insight, etc. I'm excited to hear about other burgeoning heritage areas. So I'm certainly interested in sharing more lessons learned and answering any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This was great. And thank you for